The first thing anyone noticed about the painting was that the woman in it was already dead. That was what the gallery placard said, anyway. Property of the National Collection. Oil on canvas, 61 by 48 inches, painted in 1944 by a war artist named Edmund Halloway, who never once explained where he had seen her. The woman stood in a ruined doorway, one hand pressed flat against broken stone, her eyes the color of struck brass, her skin marked with narrow silver lines that ran from her temples down into her collar like frost creeping across a window. She was not looking at the viewer. She was looking past them, at something over their shoulder, and her expression held no fear at all, only exhaustion and a kind of stubborn, burning patience. Halloway had called it Study for a Woman Who Does Not Exist. He painted it 3 weeks before he died in a bombing raid over Dresden, and he never sold a single sketch of her, never showed anyone the studies, never explained the golden eyes or the silver markings to a single soul. For 81 years the painting hung in the East Wing of the National Gallery under glass, visited by school trips and art students and the occasional obsessive who built entire theories about who she was and what Halloway had been trying to say. Nobody had ever suggested she was real. Not until the Tuesday morning in March when a woman with golden eyes and silver markings running from her temples to her collar walked into the gallery and stopped so suddenly in front of the painting that the docent behind her nearly ran into her back. Maren Okafor had worked at the National Gallery for 11 years, and in that time she had led exactly 140 diplomatic tours. She kept count. It gave her something to do with her hands while her mind wandered through the paintings, matching faces in the crowd to faces on the walls, waiting for the moment when someone finally looked past the brushwork and saw the thing underneath. This tour was supposed to be number 141, and it was supposed to be routine. A delegation from the Kaiserine remnant, what was left of an empire that had lost a war it started 3 centuries ago and was still losing the peace, touring cultural sites as part of the resettlement program. 12 refugees, 2 translators, 1 very tired human liaison from the Department of Exodus Affairs, and, at the center of the group, a young woman the briefing notes had described only as former minor nobility, non-priority contact, no press. Maren had led minor nobility before. They were usually polite and faintly bored, more interested in the gift shop than the paintings, grieving a world that didn't exist anymore in ways that made small talk about brushstrokes feel obscene. She had her patter ready. Impressionism, then the war rooms, then the modern wing, then the gift shop, then goodbye. She did not get past the second room. The woman, golden eyes, silver temple markings, dark hair pulled back in a style that looked deliberately unremarkable, as if she'd practiced blending in, stopped walking the moment she turned the corner into the East Wing. She stopped so completely that for a second Maren thought she'd been struck by something. A signal, a memory, a wave of the vertigo that sometimes hit Kaiserine refugees when Earth's gravity didn't sit right in their inner ear. Then Maren followed her gaze and understood it was worse than that. The woman was looking at the painting, at Halloway's painting, at her own face, 48 inches of oil and canvas, hanging under museum glass with a placard that called her a study for a woman who did not exist. "Ma'am," Maren said, because 11 years of protocol training gave her nothing better. "Are you all right?" The woman didn't answer. She walked toward the painting the way people walk toward the edge of something they aren't sure will hold their weight, and she stopped close enough that her breath fogged the glass, and she said, in accented but perfectly clear English, 3 words that Maren would remember for the rest of her life. "That is impossible." Her name, according to the resettlement file that landed on 3 different desks within the hour, was Isfalket Aranthi, formerly of House Aranthi, formerly third in line to a throne that had been dissolved by treaty 9 years earlier. She was 26 years old by Earth reckoning. She had been on Earth for 4 months. She had given no interviews, attended no ceremonies, and specifically requested, in writing twice, that no one treat her as anything other than an ordinary resettled civilian. She had not requested to be shown a painting of herself that predated her birth by 60 years. Dr. Priya Nathwani, the gallery's head of provenance, was the one who eventually sat down across from her in a small office that smelled like old paper and stronger coffee than either of them wanted, and asked the question that mattered. "Ms. Aranthi, have you ever seen this painting before today?" "No." "Has anyone shown you a photograph of it? A reproduction? A postcard? Anything?" "No." Isful's hands were folded very tightly in her lap. Her voice had the careful flatness of someone holding a great deal very still. I did not know it existed. I did not know your species had. I did not know anyone had ever seen. She stopped. Started again. The scar. I'm sorry. Isful touched her own jaw, just below her left ear, where a thin pale line ran perhaps 1.5 inches toward her throat. I got this scar when I was 19. A training accident, a blade that slipped. It happened on Casathold, in the 7th year of the Remnant War, 340 light-years from this room. Your painter died? She glanced at the placard, translated the date without seeming to try. 11 years before I was born, and he painted my scar. Priya had spent 19 years cataloging provenance disputes, forged signatures, misattributed brushstrokes, paintings that turned out to be over other paintings. She had never once, in 19 years, had to write the sentence she wrote in her notes that afternoon. Subject confirms anatomical detail predates subject's own existence by 6 decades. No further explanation available at this time. The story broke on a Thursday, not because anyone leaked it but because a bored graduate student cross-referencing gallery archives for an unrelated thesis noticed that a Kezaran diplomatic visit and an unscheduled 2-hour closure of the East Wing had happened on the same day, asked a docent a single-pointed question, and posted about it before anyone thought to ask her not to. By Friday, the headline had mutated into 6 different versions of the same impossible sentence. Alien princess discovers 60-year LD portrait of herself. By Saturday, Isful Ketaranthi, a woman who had spent 4 months carefully constructing a life defined by not being noticed, had a face that 70 million people had looked up in the same 48 hours. She did not leave her apartment for 6 days. Marin, against every rule of professional distance the gallery had ever written down, was the one who eventually knocked on her door, because she had been the one standing beside her when the world tilted, and something about that felt like it created an obligation neither of them had asked for. I'm not here as gallery staff, Marin said, when Isful opened the door on the security chain and looked at her through the gap with golden eyes that had gone hollow with exhaustion. I'm here because I keep thinking about how you looked at that painting, and I don't think anyone's asked you the right question yet. Isful considered this for a long moment. Then she took the chain off. The apartment was small and nearly empty, the kind of place furnished by someone who hadn't decided if they were staying. There were no photographs on the walls. There was, Marin noticed, a single framed print sitting face down on the kitchen counter, and she understood without asking that it was a reproduction of the painting, and that Isful had bought it and then immediately been unable to look at it. What's the right question? Isful asked, finally, sitting across from her at a table with 2 mismatched chairs. Not how it happened. I don't think you know that any better than we do. Marin wrapped both hands around a mug of tea she hadn't asked for and hadn't touched. I think the question is what it's doing to you, because from where I stood, it didn't look like wonder. It looked like grief. Isful was quiet for long enough that Marin thought she'd misjudged it, pushed too hard, ruined whatever fragile permission had let her through the door in the first place. Then Isful said, very softly, my homeworld doesn't exist as a nation anymore. My family's house was dissolved by a peace treaty I wasn't old enough to vote on. Everyone who might have told me stories about who I was before the war is dead, or scattered across 9 systems, or too ashamed of what my family did to speak my name. I came here to be no one. A refugee with an ordinary job and an ordinary flat and a face nobody in a crowd of 8 billion strangers would ever have reason to recognize. She looked up. And it turns out one of you has been looking at my face for 81 years. Before I was born. In a museum. Under glass. With a title that calls me a woman who does not exist. Her voice cracked very slightly on the last word. I don't know if that's the cruelest thing that has ever happened to me, or the only proof I have left that I was always going to exist at all. It was Priya, 3 weeks later, who found the thread that turned grief into mystery. Edmund Halloway had not simply painted the woman once. Buried in the gallery's own uncatalogued archive, 6 crates of studies and sketchbooks donated by his estate in 1951 and never fully processed, because nobody had ever thought a dead war artist's scrap paper was worth the labor, were 41 drawings of the same face. Some were quick, 6-line gestures, a jaw and a cheekbone and nothing else. Others were fully worked studies with notes in the margins in Holloway's cramped, slanting hand. Notes that, when Priya finally sat down and read all 41 pages in order, chilled her in a way 19 years of art history had never quite prepared her for. She dreamt of a stranger again last night, read one, dated 4 months before his death. Always the same doorway, always the same fire behind her. I begin to think she is not a dream at all but a memory belonging to someone who has not lived it yet. She asked me my name in the dream in a language I do not know and yet understood entirely, read another. I told her, and she said it back to me wrong, the way one repeats a word learned only a moment before. I woke with the sound of her voice more vivid than anything in this waking world, which grows daily less real to me than the ruin where she stands. And the last page, dated 6 days before the raid that killed him, in handwriting noticeably less steady than the rest. I do not believe she is a ghost of the past. I believe she is a person who has not yet been born, on a world I will never see, and that some door between then and now stands open only wide enough for the two of us to glimpse each other across it. I do not know why. I do not know if she will ever know my name as I know hers, though I have never once heard it spoken. I only know it the way one knows a thing in a dream. I have painted her as faithfully as I am able, so that if I am killed before I understand this, some proof will remain that she was seen. That someone somewhere was already watching for her, long before she arrived. Priya read that last line 4 times before she picked up the phone. She did not call the physicists first. She called security. It was a decision she would later have trouble explaining, even to herself. A hunch built from 19 years of handling objects that other people wanted very badly, for reasons that were not always about art. But something about the phrase "some proof will remain that she was seen" sat wrong in her stomach the moment she considered what it would mean if the wrong people believed it too. She was right to worry. 3 days after the story broke, the gallery's threat monitoring team flagged a cluster of messages moving through a Kesran diaspora forum that Doranvel's own government had quietly asked Earth's intelligence services to keep an eye on. The forum belonged, loosely, to a faction that had never accepted the treaty dissolving House Aranthi, and had spent 9 years insisting, in increasingly strident, increasingly public posts, that the old bloodlines still mattered, that the war had never really ended, only paused. To them, a human painting that appeared to prophesy the last living Aranthi daughter was not a curiosity. It was a sign. Some of the messages called her chosen. A smaller, angrier thread called her a fraud, a piece of human theater designed to prop up a claim to a throne that no longer existed, and argued calmly, in the specific tone of people who have decided violence is simply the next reasonable step, that both the woman and the painting needed to disappear before either could be used against them. Marin found out about the threat the way she found out about most things that mattered that spring. From Isfel herself, 3 days later, sitting very still at the mismatched kitchen table with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. "They want to burn it," Isfel said. "The painting. Some of them, at least. They think if it's destroyed, the idea of me goes away with it." She looked up. "They are not entirely wrong to be afraid of it. A symbol is a dangerous thing to hand to people who have already lost everything else." "Are you afraid of it?" Marin asked. "I am afraid of what it might make other people do," Isfel said. "I have stopped being afraid of what it says about me." The gallery increased security in the East Wing without announcing why. 2 additional guards, a new set of motion sensors behind the glass, a discreet rotation of Kesran liaison officers stationed near enough to intervene and far enough not to look like a cage. For 11 days nothing happened at all, which was, Priya later admitted, almost worse than something happening. 11 days of glancing at every visitor a beat too long, of flinching at unattended bags, of Marin walking her tour groups past the painting with her heart going a half-step faster than her voice let on. On the 12th night, a man was caught on the roof access stairwell above the East Wing with a cutting tool and a printed manifesto in a language the overnight guard didn't recognize but photographed anyway. He was not, in the end, a trained operative, just a frightened, furious young man from the Diaspora Forum who had convinced himself he was saving his people from a lie, and who broke down within minutes of being questioned, insisting through tears that he'd only meant to cut it from the frame, not destroy it, that he'd wanted to bring it somewhere safe where no human could use it against them anymore. Isfel asked to speak to him. The department strongly advised against it. She did it anyway, sitting across a table from a stranger who had planned, 12 hours earlier, to steal her own face out of a museum wall in the name of a war she had never asked to inherit. "I am not your queen," she told him, according to the transcript Marin read months later and never fully got out of her head. "I never will be. There is no throne left to sit on, and I would not want it if there were. But I am also not your enemy, and neither is a painting made by a man who has been dead for 80 years. If you want to protect something, protect the people who are still alive. There are 11,000 of us on this planet with nowhere else to go. Start there." The young man did not answer, but he stopped crying, and 3 weeks later one of the department liaisons mentioned, almost in passing, that he had enrolled in a resettlement mentorship program under a different caseworker, and that his name had quietly dropped off the forum's most active poster list. Isval never spoke about the rooftop incident publicly. When Priya asked her, gently, whether she wanted the extra security to stay in place, she said only, "Some things are worth protecting even after you've stopped being afraid for yourself." Then she asked whether the gallery had ever considered adding a bench in front of the painting, because her feet always hurt by the time she'd finished looking at it, and Priya understood that the conversation, for now, was over. The physicists, when they got involved, were cautiously, professionally furious about the entire situation, because it did not fit any model anyone had, and everyone in that line of work has a deep, abiding hatred for things that do not fit any model anyone has. The working theory, and it remained, everyone agreed, a working theory, nothing more, involved something the visiting Kezeran scientific attaché called a causal echo, a phenomenon documented exactly 4 times in 300 years of Kezeran astrophysics and never once satisfactorily explained. A resonance across the same point in spacetime, decades or centuries apart, strong enough in rare cases to produce a kind of bleed-through between two minds anchored to the same physical location. Holloway had lived and died in a city that would, 340 light-years and 80-odd years later, sit almost precisely on the calculated trajectory of the Kezeran refugee convoy's final approach vector. A coincidence of geometry so absurd that the attaché, a scientist named Doran Vell who had spent 4 decades refusing to believe in anything he couldn't measure twice, admitted in a briefing that he found the maths aesthetically offensive, but not regrettably wrong. "It does not mean fate," Vell said carefully, in the small conference room where Isval sat between Marin and Priya, her hands folded the same tight way they'd been the first day. "It does not mean destiny, or prophecy, or any of the words your species reaches for when the numbers make you uncomfortable. It means 2 points in spacetime under specific and vanishingly rare conditions briefly touched. A man dying in one war glimpsed a woman not yet born, living through another. That is all it means. That is all it has ever meant, the 4 times we've seen it happen. That is all," Isval repeated very quietly. "I did not say it was small," Vell said, and for the first time something in his careful, clinical voice softened. "I said it was rare." He slid a folder across the table, the other 3 documented cases, each one stripped of names and dates at the request of the families involved, translated badly enough into English that Priya suspected he'd done it himself rather than trust a machine with something this delicate. A soldier on a doomed Kezeran border world who had spent his final hours sketching, in charcoal on the back of a ration form, the face of a child not yet conceived, a child who grew up decades later to become a cartographer and recognized her own 6-year-old self in a museum donation without ever knowing why. A composer who wrote, in the last week of a terminal illness, a lullaby she said had been given to her by a woman she'd never met, a lullaby that turned out, 40 years afterward, to be note-for-note identical to one an elderly widow still hummed to her grandchildren, a widow who had never heard the composer's name in her life. A pair of twins on opposite sides of an ocean, born 4 decades apart, who each independently described the same recurring dream of a lighthouse neither had ever visited, until a record search found that both had, at different points in their lives, stood on the exact same collapsed foundation where a real lighthouse had once stood. 4 cases in 300 years, Vell said, all of them tied to violence or grief, or a place worn thin by both. We do not understand the mechanism. We have theories about resonant trauma and gravitational shear and things I will not pretend to explain to you in a language that was not built for the mathematics involved. What we know is this: it does not choose kings. It does not choose the important or the powerful or the ones history would think to remember. It chose a soldier and a dying composer and a pair of twins who never amounted to anything more than two people who loved a lighthouse they'd never properly seen. He looked at Isfel for a long moment. And it chose a war artist and a woman not yet born, standing in the same doorway 81 years apart. Cannot tell you why. I can only tell you that in every case we have ever recorded, the person on the receiving end described the same thing afterward, whether they called it a vision or a dream or a memory that did not belong to them. What did they describe? Isfel asked. Being certain, for the rest of their lives, that someone had truly seen them. Not their title. Not their use to anyone else. Just them. Vel closed the folder. For what it is worth, Ms. Aranthe, in 300 years of study, no one has ever reported the sensation as unwelcome. Frightening at first. Never unwelcome. The gallery reopened the East Wing on a Tuesday in June, and this time it did so with a second placard beside the first, one that had taken 4 separate committees, 2 governments, and one deeply reluctant Isfel Aranthe to approve. Marin was the one who suggested the wording, in the end, sitting again at that same small mismatched table with the reproduction print finally, after 3 months, turned face up on the counter behind them. You don't have to let them use your name, Marin said. You don't have to let them use your face at all, beyond what's already painted. You could ask them to take it down entirely, put it in storage, make it disappear. I think they'd do it if you asked. Isfel looked at the print for a long time. At the doorway, the fire, the hand pressed flat against broken stone. At an expression she now understood, because Priya's translation of Vel's report had made this much plain, was not exhaustion or defiance at all, not exactly. It was a woman who, for one impossible unmeasured second 81 years before her own birth, had felt someone looking at her from very far away, and had looked back. No, Isfel said finally. I don't want it hidden. What do you want it to say? Isfel was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, slowly, translating something in her own head before she let it become English. Say that a man who never met her believed she was worth watching for. Before she had a name. Before she had a war to survive or a family to lose or a world to leave behind. Say that someone somewhere was already keeping a place for her. Not because of what she would become or what her family was, but simply because she existed, and that was reason enough. She looked up, and for the first time since the day she'd stopped so suddenly in the East Wing that a docent nearly ran into her, something in her face had gone quiet and unclenched. I would like that to be true about more than one painting. I would like it to be true about the rest of my life as well. The new placard, when it finally went up beside Holloway's study for a woman who does not exist, was shorter than anyone on the committee had wanted and longer than Isfel had wanted, which everyone involved eventually agreed meant it was probably right. Painted 1944, by Edmund Holloway, artist, who died before he could learn her name. Confirmed 2026 to be a study of Isfel Aranthe, who was born 11 years after his death, 340 light-years away, and who chose to let this painting remain on public view. She has asked that it no longer be described as a study of a woman who does not exist. She exists. She stood here in front of it on a Tuesday in March, and it recognized her before she recognized it. Marin still led tours through the East Wing, though these days she skipped the Impressionists more often than she used to and lingered longer by the war rooms. She had, by her own count, led 211 diplomatic tours by the following spring, and most of them still ended with polite interest and a trip to the gift shop. But once or twice a season, a visitor stopped in front of that particular canvas, read the placard twice, and looked up with an expression Marin had learned to recognize. Not confusion exactly, and not even disbelief, but the specific, quiet vertigo of a person realizing that the universe was very slightly larger and stranger and kinder than they had assumed it to be that morning. On those days, Marin always let them stand there as long as they needed to. She understood, better than most people alive, exactly how long that could take. Isfel visited twice a year, always on a weekday, always early, before the crowds. She never announced it. The gallery staff had learned, without ever being told to, simply to leave her alone with the painting for exactly as long as she wanted, and then to nod once when she finally turned and walked back out into a city that had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to let her be an ordinary woman with an extraordinary story instead of the other way around. She still didn't know why the door between her and Holloway had opened for those few seconds, 81 years and 340 light-years apart, out of every point in space and time that might have touched instead. Vell's team never found another causal echo strong enough to study properly. The phenomenon remained, in the end, one of the universe's small, unrepeatable cruelties or kindnesses, depending on the day you asked her. But she had stopped needing the answer to matter as much as the fact itself. Someone had been watching for her. Long before she had a name for what she was. Long before the war took her home and her family's name and nearly her sense of who she was allowed to become. Someone, somewhere, had already decided she was worth painting as if she mattered. It turned out that was enough to build a life on. Not proof of destiny. Just proof, hanging under glass in a quiet wing of a gallery on a planet she hadn't been born to inherit, that she had always, somehow, already been seen. There was, in the end, a bench. Priya had it installed the autumn after the rooftop incident. A plain wooden thing with no plaque and no explanation, positioned exactly far enough from the painting that a person could sit and look without craning their neck. Nobody outside the gallery staff ever knew why it was there, or why the guards never moved anyone along who sat on it for an hour or two, or, on one particular Tuesday the following March, almost the entire length of a slow gray afternoon. Marin was working the east wing that day, and she watched Isfel sit on that bench for a long time without saying anything at all. Her golden eyes fixed on the woman in the doorway, on the fire and the broken stone and the hand pressed flat against a world that no longer existed in either of their lifetimes. When Isfel finally stood to leave, she paused beside Marin the way she always did, and for once she said something more than goodbye. "He never learned my name," Isfel said, looking back once at the canvas. "Not really. Not the sound of it, not the weight it would come to carry. He only knew that I was worth watching for. I think some days that might be the more important kind of knowing." Then she walked out into a city that had, slowly and imperfectly, learned to let her be an ordinary woman with an extraordinary story instead of the other way around, and the painting stayed where it had always been, waiting, the way it had been waiting for 81 years before she ever walked through the door to find it, for someone to finally come home to it.